I had been driving for hours, exhausted after a long, draining day. All I wanted was to get home as quickly as possible, but the gas gauge warned me that I needed to make a stop. The road was deserted, with nothing but trees and darkness surrounding me, when I finally spotted the faint lights of a lonely gas station ahead. It was a relief, even though the place seemed forgotten, far from any signs of life. I pulled into the station and parked next to the gas pump. There was only a dim light illuminating the area, casting long, eerie shadows that made the place feel even more unsettling. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, glancing around. There were no other cars in sight, except for a man sitting on a bench near the convenience store, his face partially hidden by a hat. He remained motionless, and even though he wasn't doing anything, his presence made me uneasy. I tried to ignore him. Just another stranger at a gas station, I told myself. I grabbed the gas nozzle and began refueling, trying to keep my eyes on the car and avoid looking in the man's direction. The sound of the gas filling the tank brought me some comfort, but I still felt the weight of his stare, even though he hadn't moved. When the tank was full, I returned the nozzle and went inside to pay. As I entered the store, the rancid smell of old coffee hit me, and I glanced at the cashier, a middle-aged man who didn't seem the least bit interested in me or anything else around him. I paid quickly and left, exchanging only a few words. Once I was back in the car and started the engine, I felt an immediate sense of relief. I was finally back on the road, but just a few miles down the road, something strange happened. The engine began to sputter, as if it were losing power. I looked at the dashboard, and to my shock and horror, the gas gauge was nearly empty again. It made no sense. I had just filled the tank. How could it be empty so quickly? My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe there was a problem with the tank, or perhaps there was a leak. But the more terrifying thought was that someone, possibly that man at the gas station, had sabotaged my car. Panic began to set in. I was alone on a deserted road, and my car was on the verge of completely breaking down. As the engine sputtered and struggled to keep going, I spotted a solitary house up ahead. It was small and appeared run down, with faint lights glowing from inside. It seemed like my only option. Reluctantly, but with no alternatives, I decided to pull over and ask for help. I parked in front of the gate and turned off the engine, feeling my stomach tighten with unease. Something had felt wrong since I'd left the gas station, but I had no choice. I needed help. I got out of the car, hesitating for a moment before approaching the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I finally knocked. The wooden door was old and weathered, and the sound of my knock echoed into the night. Minutes passed, and I considered turning back to my car when I finally heard footsteps from inside. The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with a wide smile, though his eyes didn't match his friendly greeting. There was something off about him. His gaze lacked warmth, and the way he stood made me immediately distrustful. He introduced himself as Tom, with a voice that was almost too friendly. "Car trouble, miss?" he asked, tilting his head in an odd manner. "I can take a look. I've got some tools in the garage." I hesitated, trying to think of an excuse to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The car barely had any gas left, and I was isolated. I nodded, trying to remain calm. "Yeah, the tank's empty, but I just filled it up. Maybe something's wrong," I replied, hoping he would simply take a look and let me go. He smiled again, this time even wider, showing yellowed teeth. "Let's take a look," he said, gesturing for me to follow him to the car. As he went to grab tools from the garage, I glanced around. The place was eerily quiet. No rustling trees, no distant sounds of cars, just the wind and the creaking of the old house. When he returned, he started fiddling with the hood of the car, but something was off. He didn't seem to be fixing anything. His movements were slow, and with each question he asked, I realized he wasn't interested in the car at all. He was asking about me, where I was headed, who I was with, why I was alone. My instincts kicked into high alert. His questions were invasive, and I knew I couldn't trust him. The discomfort quickly turned into fear. I needed to get out of there immediately. "Looks like I won't be able to fix this right now. You should come inside while I finish up," he said, now with a strange smile that sent chills down my spine. "No, thank you," I replied quickly. "I've already taken up too much of your time. I'll try to make it to the next station." "I insist," he said, stepping closer, as if trying to block my escape. My heart began to race. Without saying another word, I darted to the driver's side, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. My heart was pounding so fast I could barely think. I quickly locked the car door and tried to start the engine. The motor sputtered, hesitated, but finally roared to life. Tom was still standing beside the car, his sinister smile fading as he realized I wasn't staying. "Wait! I haven't finished checking the car," he shouted, banging on the window with his heavy hand. The sound sent a shiver through my entire body, but I was determined to get away. With my foot firmly on the gas pedal, the car jerked forward along the dirt road, and for a moment, I thought he might chase me. Tom stood there for a few seconds, still pounding on the window in frustration. When I finally managed to pick up speed, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing in the road, arms raised in a mix of anger and something far darker. I kept driving, not daring to look back again, feeling a mixture of relief and growing dread. The gas gauge was still dangerously low, but I knew I had to find a safe place as soon as possible. The road was empty and dark, and the tension in my chest only grew. Every minute felt like an eternity. At last, I spotted the lights of a small town up ahead. Relief began to wash over me, though fear and suspicion still lingered. As soon as I reached the well-lit, busier area, I pulled into a more populated gas station. This time, there were plenty of cars around. I stepped out of the car, still trembling, and headed into the convenience store to call for help and make sense of what had just happened. The clerk, noticing my shaken state, asked if I was all right. I quickly explained what had happened, from the strange man at the gas station to the isolated house and the man who had tried to stop me from leaving. His face grew serious, and he suggested I contact the police immediately. As I waited for the police to arrive, I began to process everything. It was terrifying to think about what could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. The man at the original gas station had likely tampered with my car, and Tom, the man from the house, had clearly been trying to lure me into something sinister. The thought that I had come so close to something horrible made me shudder even more. When the police arrived, I gave my statement, still shaken. They promised to investigate, but deep down, I knew those dark, isolated roads held their own secrets, and I might never get answers about what truly happened that night. As I drove back home, the car now running smoothly and the road lit by the early morning sun, one thing was clear. I would never again trust isolated gas stations, overly helpful strangers, or any place that made me feel vulnerable. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, and I was heading home after a long, exhausting day. The road was practically deserted, with only a few trees in the distance, and the sky slowly shifting from orange to purple. I had been driving for a while when I noticed the gas gauge was dangerously low. I tried to stay calm, but the stress began to build as I couldn't see any gas stations nearby. After a few more minutes, the inevitable happened. The car started to sputter and came to a stop on the side of the road. I sighed in frustration. I looked around, hoping that, by some stroke of luck, another car might pass. There was no sign of life anywhere. I grabbed my phone, and to make matters worse, I had no signal. Anxiety started to creep in. I had no idea how long I'd be stuck there, alone in the middle of nowhere, waiting for help. After about 15 minutes, a car finally appeared on the horizon. It was a well-maintained black sedan. As it got closer, it slowed down and pulled up next to me. The passenger window rolled down slowly, and a man with an unremarkable appearance smiled at me in a friendly way. He looked to be in his 40s with light brown hair and was wearing a simple dress shirt. His voice was calm as he asked, "Car trouble?" I hesitated for a moment, but then answered, "Yes, I ran out of gas and there's no cell signal here." He nodded empathetically. "I can give you a ride to the nearest gas station. It's not far, just about 10 minutes away." I looked at him, weighing my options. He seemed harmless, and the thought of being alone out here in the dark was even more frightening. "Okay," I agreed, trying to keep my composure. "Thank you." I got into the car, and he smiled again as I fastened my seatbelt. He drove smoothly, and for a few minutes, everything seemed normal. We made small talk about trivial things, the weather, the road conditions, He seemed kind, just someone trying to help. As we drove, a growing silence settled between us. He kept his eyes on the road while I stared out the window, trying not to dwell too much on the situation I found myself in. Everything seemed fine until, suddenly, I heard a strange noise coming from the back of the car, something like a soft thump, barely noticeable at first. My body froze for a moment, and I strained my ears, trying to figure out what I had just heard. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just the car hitting a bump on the road. But then the noise came again, this time louder, like something or someone was banging against the inside of the trunk. My heart started racing, but I kept staring out the window, pretending I hadn't noticed anything. But the noise persisted. Now, in addition to the thumping, I could hear what sounded like scratching or something pushing against the inside. Panic began to rise in my chest. I glanced briefly at the man, who seemed oblivious to it all. He drove calmly, his focus fixed on the road ahead. Every instinct in my body was on high alert. Something was very, very wrong. The noise grew louder, and this time I was certain. It sounded like desperate banging. It was the sound of someone trapped inside. The pounding from the trunk grew more intense, and my panic only escalated. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't act too hastily. The man hadn't noticed that I was becoming increasingly nervous, which, in a way, bought me some time to think. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, though my heart was beating so fast, it felt like I might lose control at any moment. I scanned my surroundings, desperate for an opportunity to escape. That's when I spotted a traffic light ahead, with the light about to turn red. This could be my chance. As we approached the light, I did everything I could not to draw attention to myself, but I was already bracing for action. When the car came to a complete stop at the light, I grabbed the door handle. Without hesitating, I opened the door and bolted out of the car before he could react. "Hey, what are you doing?" he shouted, but I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, adrenaline surging through my veins. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it might burst. I heard him get out of the car and call after me again, but I was too far away to clearly hear what he was saying. My only thought was to keep running. Up ahead, I saw a convenience store, and with trembling legs and fear propelling me, I sprinted toward it. As I reached the door, I practically threw myself inside, gasping for breath. The store clerk looked at me, startled, and hurried over. "Are you okay? What happened?" he asked, concerned. Still trying to catch my breath, I quickly explained what had happened, but I was in shock. The police were called, and for the first time, I felt safe. Even so, the banging from the trunk and the memory of the man trying to stop me from leaving kept echoing in my head. It was getting late when I realized the gas gauge was on empty. I had spent the entire day driving, dealing with appointments, and honestly, hadn't paid much attention to the fuel level. The road was deserted, and the sky was already darkening. I knew I should have stopped at a gas station earlier, but now there wasn't much I could do. The car sputtered, the engine died, and I pulled over onto the shoulder. The silence that followed was heavy, the absence of the engine noise amplifying the isolation around me. I got out of the car and looked around, but there was nothing but tall trees and a seemingly endless road stretching ahead. My phone had no signal, and the thought of staying there all night was terrifying. I waited, hoping that a car would pass, but the road seemed completely abandoned. The temperature was dropping, and I began to feel increasingly vulnerable. Then, finally, I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my hand, praying that the driver would stop and be trustworthy. The car pulled over next to me, and a man lowered the window. He was middle-aged, wearing an old jacket, and seemed friendly enough. "Out of gas?" he asked with a smile. I nodded, relieved that someone had finally stopped. "I can give you a ride to the nearest gas station, but it's a bit far. Want me to take you there?" he offered. As the car moved along the deserted road, the silence between us grew heavier. The man, who had initially seemed friendly, now kept his eyes fixed on the road, and the slight discomfort I had felt when I first got into the car began to turn into something more unsettling. He asked trivial questions at first, where I was coming from, where I was headed, but his tone had changed. There was something about the way he asked that put me on edge, as if he was trying to learn more than necessary. After a few minutes, the atmosphere inside the car became even more tense. His questions became more invasive, asking if I was alone, if anyone knew where I was. Each of my answers was careful, trying not to reveal too much, but I also didn't want him to know I was scared. Then, without any warning, he abruptly stopped the car in the middle of the road. The screeching brakes tore through the silence, leaving me paralyzed. The man turned to me with a sinister grin that had nothing to do with the friendly demeanor he'd shown earlier. "Now, hand over your wallet and phone," he said, his voice cold and threatening. My body froze. What had started as an innocent ride had turned into a trap. I was alone, with no help in sight, and a stranger was demanding everything I had. My mind raced, searching for a way out, any way to escape. "Come on, I don't want any trouble," he continued, growing impatient. "Just hand it over." With my heart pounding, I knew I had to act fast. My only chance of escape was to run, and the forest on the side of the road seemed like my only option. Without thinking twice, I unlocked the door and, in one swift motion, darted out of the car, sprinting straight into the darkness of the trees. I heard the man yell after me and get out of the car to chase me, but by then I was already running as fast as I could. The trees were dense, their branches scratching my face and arms as I ran, but the fear of being caught pushed me to keep going. I knew if I stopped, he would catch me. As the car moved along the deserted road, the silence between us grew heavier. The man, who had initially seemed friendly, now kept his eyes fixed on the road, and the slight discomfort I had felt when I first got into the car began to turn into something more unsettling. He asked trivial questions at first, where I was coming from, where I was headed, but his tone had changed. There was something about the way he asked that put me on edge, as if he was trying to learn more than necessary. After a few minutes, the atmosphere inside the car became even more tense. His questions became more invasive, asking if I was alone, if anyone knew where I was. Each of my answers was careful, trying not to reveal too much, but I also didn't want him to know I was scared. Then, without any warning, he abruptly stopped the car in the middle of the road. The screeching brakes tore through the silence, leaving me paralyzed. The man turned to me with a sinister grin that had nothing to do with the friendly demeanor he'd shown earlier. "Now, hand over your wallet and phone," he said, his voice cold and threatening. My body froze. What had started as an innocent ride had turned into a trap. I was alone, with no help in sight, and a stranger was demanding everything I had. My mind raced, searching for a way out, any way to escape. "Come on, I don't want any trouble," he continued, growing impatient. "Just hand it over." With my heart pounding, I knew I had to act fast. My only chance of escape was to run, and the forest on the side of the road seemed like my only option. Without thinking twice, I unlocked the door, and in one swift motion, darted out of the car, sprinting straight into the darkness of the trees. I heard the man yell after me and get out of the car to chase me, but by then I was already running as fast as I could. The trees were dense, their branches scratching my face and arms as I ran, but the fear of being caught pushed me to keep going. I knew if I stopped, he would catch me.